I live in a small suburban area of Vancouver, British Columbia, an unassuming place, surrounded by industrial complexes and highways leading to bigger, more interesting locations. My house is a basic duplex. Used to live here with my parents, but they moved uptown and they left the place to me. I spend most of my time trying to survive whatever my online university courses throw at me week to week. So naturally, I get stressed on the regular. I used to remedy this by going on walks at night while listening to some music. It helped to calm my nerves. Though sometimes I just got an odd feeling on these walks. A feeling like I was being watched even though there was usually nobody else around, except maybe the odd neighbor taking their dog out to do its business. I got anxious. Scared someone or something was following me, and I got the urge to turn around and check behind me, even though I was terrified of what I might see when I did. Of course, when I did give in to the urge, there was always nothing there. Just faded streetlights, trees, and empty streets. I always felt stupid for doing this, thinking to myself, of course there's nothing there, you idiot. I always reminded myself there was nothing dangerous or scary lurking around this boring, quiet neighborhood. I don't believe that anymore. One night, in around mid-August, I was sitting on the couch downstairs in the front room of my house, doing some studying. It was around 1 in the morning, and I was getting stressed because my final exam I was studying for was in 2 days. And I had wasted my previous week playing Red Dead Redemption 2. So as I usually did in those kinds of situations, I threw on my sandals and I stepped outside for a stroll. It was quiet, but not unnaturally so. Typically, nobody would be out at this time, save for me, and that was the case on that night. Or so I thought. The only sounds were the faint hum of the streetlights and the roar of the engine of the odd car driving down the nearby highway. I stepped out of the front gate of my yard, put in my earbuds, and I threw on my favorite playlist. I didn't sense anything out of the ordinary at first. My music was only playing at around half volume, so I could still hear the familiar silence around me. The temperature was about what one could expect at 1 AM in late summer in Western Canada. There was the familiar anxiety of being watched, but since I knew that there wasn't anyone else out there, I chose to ignore it and carry on with my walk. Everything was fine. I wish it had stayed that way. I had maybe gotten 5 or 6 feet away from my house when I noticed the flickering of the streetlights. They're pretty old, so it wasn't out of the ordinary to see them flicker slightly. But that night, it was more erratic and pronounced. I also noticed only a few of them were behaving like that. Only the ones near me. I saw the ones closest to me flickering so alarmingly and uncommonly fast, while the ones further down the street in front of me were seemingly normal. And then my earbuds started to malfunction. The audio quality took a steep dive, with the music becoming scratchy and cutting in and out. I unplugged the wire from the jack and I chalked it all up to simply being an odd coincidence. And then these strange occurrences became harder to ignore. I then suddenly became aware of an odd sensation, one that made the hairs on my arm and the back of my neck stand straight up. One that chorused throughout my body, almost feeling like tiny jolts of electricity running through my veins. I've experienced things like sudden chills, static shocks, and stuff like that, but this was different. Those kinds of things usually only last for a second and then go away. This wasn't. This feeling just made me more and more tense. I knew something odd was going on. And then came the breathing. I hadn't heard it at first because I had still been listening to my music before. I took notice of the lights and the weird tinkling feeling, but it was there. It sounded close, maybe a couple feet behind me. I must be losing it. I nervously thought to myself, if somebody were that close to me, I surely would have known by now, right? It wasn't just how close it seemed to be that disturbed me, it was also how it sounded. It was ragged breathing, like that of someone who had just run a 100-yard dash. It also didn't sound exactly human. It was distorted and freakish, like someone blowing through spinning fan blades. It also sounded as if whatever was breathing was violently sucking in and exhaling air, rather than normally breathing. It wasn't normal. I had thought nobody was out there with me. I thought it was okay to simply push away the fear of being watched. The fear came rushing back when I heard that awful breathing. I couldn't ignore it. The lights were still flickering. My body still felt as if it were full of pins and needles, and the breathing was still there. I took a deep breath, counting down on my head from 3, and whipped my body around to face whoever was behind me. It was almost totally dark when I turned around. All the streetlights behind me had turned off, leaving the sidewalk and street nearly completely shrouded in shadow. I couldn't see very well, but my eyes were adjusted enough to at least see 2 feet ahead, which is how close the breathing sounded. Yet I saw nothing there. The breathing suddenly stopped, as if whatever was there was trying to remain unnoticed. As my eyes continued to adjust to the darkness, I decided to call out to my pursuer. "Who's there?" I yelled aggressively into the night, not caring who I woke up by doing so. I waited a few seconds and got nothing in response. I could see a bit further now, and I peered into the blackness to see if I could catch a glimpse of whoever had been following me. I suddenly saw something that made my entire being seize up in fear. It was a figure standing ominously behind a tree. I couldn't see it all too well, but it was definitely there. It looked to be around 10 to 15 feet behind me, which didn't make much sense as the breathing had sounded much closer. It was tall, abnormally so, probably around 9 to 10 feet in height. Its form was roughly humanoid, but wrong. It had long, gangly arms, reaching down past what I assume were its knees. Its head was small compared to the rest of its body, and it was extremely misshapen. I couldn't see if it had eyes, but I could just feel that it was looking straight at me. I couldn't tell if it was simply the lack of light, and my own terror playing tricks with my eyes, but its entire body seemed to be pitch black, darker than I even thought possible, almost as if it were entirely composed of emptiness, a void that had taken shape. I thought I also saw small tendrils lash out at random from its form. Different parts of its figure appeared to warp and quiver, like it was barely holding its corporeal appearance together. I didn't stick around long after that to get a better look. Nearly paralyzed out of sheer terror, I thought of ways that I could get back inside my house safely. If I ran straight back down the sidewalk, that thing might have just ran straight towards me and it would get me. I couldn't run around the back and get in through the garage because I didn't have my door opener. Left with really only one option. I broke out of my frozen state, just long enough to take a sharp right into my neighbor's yard, and jumped over the small hedges back into my yard. I fumbled with my keys, not wanting to even look back to check if the being was getting closer. I managed to get the door opened and I threw myself inside, slamming it shut behind me. I locked the door and ran around the house making sure every possible point of entry was secure. I locked the windows, closed the vents, even plugged up the sinks and drains. I didn't know what the heck that thing was or what it could do, but I did know that I didn't want it anywhere near me. I went into my bedroom, barricaded the door, and turned on all the lights. Collapsing onto my bed, I had a moment to truly process what had just happened. I was just chased by some unknowable being. Something I used to think was a situation exclusive to people in campfire tales and horror stories. But it happened. I know it did. I wasn't going crazy. I wasn't having some stress-induced hallucination. That thing was as real as my own skin and bones. I was sure of it. I don't know how long I just sat on my bed, curled up in a ball. I didn't know what to do. I certainly didn't want to look outside to see if it was still there. I debated calling the police, but concluded they would most likely have thought it was some drunken moron spouting nonsense. I decided I would call my girlfriend just to tell her about the absolutely insane experience I just had, and so I could hear a familiar voice. I was about to dial the first digit of her number, but then my cell phone suddenly turned off all on its own. And then the lights started flickering. I knew it was back, I just knew it. I felt my hair standing on end and the shocking sensation spreading throughout my body. Same as before, but somehow worse. I didn't know where it was. It couldn't possibly be inside the house, I told myself in a frenzied panic. I locked all of the possible ways anything could get in. But then again, I guess I didn't really know what was possible at that point. "Where are you?" I screamed out amidst the chaos of the flickering lights and my own feelings of absolute confusion and alarm.
"Where are you?"
It spoke. The thing spoke. It had a voice that made my blood turn to ice. A voice unlike anything I had heard before. I will most likely continue to hear it over and over in my head for the rest of my life. If I had to describe it, I would say it had the same sort of distorted and ragged quality as its breathing, but infinitely more unnerving. It sounded as if its throat was full of mucus and blood. Its pitch alternated between inhumanly deep and ear-bleedingly shrill, and the way that it pronounced words was indescribably strange, almost making them unrecognizable as English. I was so horrified by hearing that voice that it took me a couple of seconds to realize that it had copied me.
"Where are you?"
It said again in that dreadful tone. I couldn't distinguish where it was coming from. It sounded like it was all around me.
"Where are you?"
It repeated once more. I kept hearing it repeat and repeat and repeat, almost as if it were mocking me. I covered my ears in an attempt to block out the horrid voice, but to no avail. The lights continued to flicker, faster and faster all around me, until all the light bulbs simultaneously sparked and shattered, plunging the room into darkness. There was nothing I could do but cry to myself in the darkness. After what seemed like hours, it finally stopped. It was totally silent. I continued to sit on my bed and wait, worried to let my guard down despite the feeling of relief. After a while, I mustered up the courage to peek through the blinds to check if it was still there. And I shouldn't have. The thing was there, but it wasn't still at the end of the sidewalk. It wasn't at my front gate. It wasn't inside my yard. It was right outside of my window, looking in with its face against the glass. I stifled a gasp and immediately retreated from the window. The blinds were closed again, so I still couldn't see it. But what I did see for that split second looking through the blinds had burned itself permanently into my brain. I had seen its face. It was just as dark and empty as the rest of its body, except for a huge, toothy, grinning maw and two bloodshot human eyes. I backed up until I was against my door, trembling and shaking uncontrollably. Tears ran down my face as I became overwhelmed with an unfathomable sense of pure fear and existential dread.
"Where are you?"
It screeched, much more aggressively than the previous times.
"Where are you?"
It growled again. It then started to produce what sounded like laughter, but was just as off-putting and disturbing as everything else about it. It was not jovial or mischievous laughter, but laughter that was deeply evil, dripping with wicked intent and malice. It continued to speak, but no longer repeated what I had said. No, what it uttered next was much, much worse.
Help me. Get away. Run. What is that thing? Save me, Mommy. It's killing everyone.
It repeated these phrases over and over, in that skin-crawlingly devilish voice. It didn't stop at just the phrases either. It screamed and it cried, and even somehow made noises that can only be described as sounding like bones being broken, flesh being ripped apart, and limbs being twisted and torn. I started hearing terrible scratching sounds, as if 100 chalkboards were being clawed all at once. It was trying to get in. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. I couldn't even scream. The scratching persisted, getting faster and more intense with each passing second. The entity let out a preternatural howl. I heard the glass crack. I blacked out. When I came to, it was no longer dark outside. The sun had risen. I looked around my room and all of my electronics seemed to be functioning again. I checked my phone. It was 6:30 a.m. I hesitantly examined the window, and while there were hundreds of claw marks and a huge fracture, the nightmarish thing that had made them had vanished. I searched everywhere in my house to make sure it wasn't hiding somewhere, and I found nothing. I called a repair company right away to replace the window, and then proceeded to try and inform everyone I could on what had happened. Naturally, everyone thought that I was either crazy, playing a joke on them, or just extremely high at the time. Nobody believes me, but I know that it happened. I don't go for walks at night anymore. I've tried to do research on what that thing was, but I haven't been able to find anything substantial. I don't know what it was, how it got here, or why I didn't die that night, but I will never forget it. I still hear its tainted voice when I'm alone, and sometimes when I close my eyes, I can still see its gruesome visage. I haven't seen it again since that night, and I pray every night to whoever is listening that I never do again.